Hi, everybody, and welcome to iWonder's monthly webinars. I'm Vijeta Raghuram, the Program Manager Education at India Bioscience and an Associate Editor of iWonder. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, iWonder is a science magazine for middle and high school teachers. It features writings about the many dimensions of teaching and learning science in class and outside it. It is published in English, Hindi, and Kannada twice a year. If you are a practicing science teacher, we invite you to write for us. To do this, please send your idea in about 100 words to iwonder@apu.edu.in. If you would like to receive updates of each webinar and a free print version of each issue, subscribe to us by following the link displayed in the description of this video. You can also catch us on Facebook. On the second Wednesday of every month, like today, we invite authors of an article in iWonder for a live discussion. For today's webinar, we have with us Melanie Trecek-King, author of the booklet 11 Characteristics of Pseudoscience from our December 2021 issue. Melanie is an associate professor of biology at Massasoit Community College in Massachusetts with over 20 years of teaching experience in college and high school classrooms. Her passion for science education led her to create a website called Thinking is Power to provide accessible and engaging critical thinking information to the general public and to other educators interested in incorporating more critical thinking content in their courses. You can visit her blog at thinkingispower.com. Melanie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Before we start, let me give our audience a brief overview of the format of the discussion today. For the first 30 minutes, I will ask Melanie some questions to delve a little deeper into her booklet. All those who have joined us today, please type your questions in the chat box. In the last 30 minutes of the webinar, I'll request Melanie to share her insights on these questions. So, Melanie, as you know, we have shared a quiz on social media. We post 5 claims and requested the participants to identify the pseudoscientific claims among them. We received a total of 105 responses, and we're really excited that we got such a great response. Now, out of those 105 responses, 15 participants were able to correctly identify all the scientific and pseudoscientific claims. The rest, 90, misidentified anywhere between 1 to all 5 claims. This shows that we collectively have a very varying understanding of how pseudoscience may differ from science. Keeping this in mind, let's start with the basics. What is pseudoscience, and why is it important to differentiate it from science?
Oh, that's a great question. Pseudoscience is actually really difficult to define. Generally, it means fake science, or I call it a science pretender. Pseudoscience is, it makes itself out to be scientific, but it isn't following the processes, the parts of science that make science reliable. Interesting that you found that only 15 out of 105 were able to correctly identify all of them, if I understood that correctly. Yeah. So, nobody identifies as a pseudoscientist, right? Nobody says, yes, my beliefs are pseudoscientific, because we all understand that science is reliable. So what we tend to do is, if we believe in something, we think it's scientific. We see the evidence in support of it as being scientific, as opposed to evaluating claims for how reliable they are. We tend to think, if I believe in something, that it's probably scientific. Now, I'm not sure if that's why people got some of those questions wrong. But in general, I mean, nobody says, yeah, my beliefs are pseudoscientific. But I think it's important to be able to spot the difference, because I mean, a lot of pseudoscience claims are actually harmful. Some of them are probably benign, but others, we've seen during the pandemic, various pseudoscientific beliefs that have literally gotten people killed.
Now, so we have a tendency to believe in things, and we sort of think that they are scientific. We are sort of trying to rationalize what we believe. Is that what you're trying to
Yeah.
say?
Yes, definitely.
So is that why pseudoscience is so rampant? What is your thought on why pseudoscience is so rampant?
That's a really good question. There are a lot of biases that cause us to fall for very pseudoscientific claims. Our existing worldviews, the people around us. But I think one of the most important aspects of pseudoscience is that it tends to give us hope or something that we're missing. So like pseudoscience health claims, if you are, for example, have an illness that is chronic and therefore, science doesn't have a great answer, or if you maybe even have a fatal condition and we don't have the ability through science to do anything, pseudoscience steps in with, well, here's all you have to do, right? Here is the answer that you've been looking for. And so we fall for things that are hope, right? Or, I mean, even something simple like, if you're getting older, would love to have the fountain of youth. So, yeah, I'll buy that face cream or that supplement or whatever that promises me something that's probably not true, but I need it for some reason. And so recognizing our own desires, our own identity needs is one of the most important steps to being able to identify pseudoscience.
I guess that's why we believe it so readily, isn't it?
Definitely.
Now, why is it important to include pseudoscience in a science class?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I never used to do this. I taught science classes and presented, environmental science and biology and so on. And then I started including pseudoscience, and I realized how wonderful it is to teach real science. Carl Sagan has a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but if we teach only the findings of science, no matter how useful and inspiring they may be, without communicating science's critical method, then how is anyone to be able to tell the difference between science and pseudoscience? So what we do in science classes is we give students the findings of science, and then they go online and they see something that, just looks like a fact or a finding of science, and they're not able to spot the difference in how that finding, how the process that led to that finding. And the process that leads to that finding is what makes something more or less reliable. So by only teaching science, and in particular the findings of science, without including pseudoscience, then I think it's more difficult for students to be able to spot the difference. Also, students have pseudoscientific beliefs. We all do, right? And so in class, addressing that misinformation, those beliefs head on, and helping students think through the process that led to those beliefs can help them in the real world spot the difference and also address their own beliefs. The other thing is it's engaging. I mean, like I include, ghosts and homeopathy, and students see those things in real life, in real life, they're face to face with those claims. And those are interesting claims. And so by including them in class, I get students to think about those claims. And then when I present real science or better science, they can see the difference and then understand why one claim is more reliable than the other.
Now, how important is it for teachers, especially science teachers, to recognize pseudoscience claims? And how do we as teachers develop and strengthen this ability?
Um, that's a really hard question. I personally, I went through my own process when I realized the way that I was teaching wasn't necessarily the most effective. And so, I went through a process of trying to figure out a better way to teach these things. And I stumbled upon pseudoscience. And if we don't understand it ourselves, then we're not able to teach it to students. And so, even starting with something like if we're teaching students the process of science as opposed to just the findings, then we have to understand the process of science, which means that we also have to understand what science isn't, what looks like science but that isn't. And for myself, it was a process of rethinking some of my own beliefs and trying to internalize for myself what pseudoscience and science was. But now that I've done that, I can more readily present that in the classroom with my students.
Yeah, I totally understand. I mean, I'm sure that, as teachers learn to understand what is pseudoscience and learn ways to identify it and use those tools regularly, I think it will eventually influence the way they teach science to children as well. Now, one may argue that evaluating such claims may require some understanding of the process of science, right? Like you just mentioned, um, Carl Sagan's quote, and that just totally beautifully captures that idea. Now, while teaching children about pseudoscience, um, what at what grade or age level do you think children are likely to be equipped to begin understanding this?
I honestly think the earlier the better. What you want to do something that's age appropriate, but we're basically teaching students how to think. You actually said something there that was really wonderful, which is we have to learn to use the tools ourselves before we can teach them to others. And that's really what we're doing, is we're learning how to use the tools of science and critical thinking to understand claims and our own beliefs. And we can't teach it to others until we understand it ourselves. But if we're teaching another human being, a young developing one, how to think, then giving them those tools as early as possible, again, in an age appropriate way, helps them refine their thinking before bad habits start to set in. Even, I mean, they're impressionable then. We have a chance to give them tools and equip them to think, so that they don't have to unlearn as many things later.
Now, in this regards, one of our authors in one of the past issues has sent me a question related to today's webinar, and let me read it out to you. Professor Kamal Lodaya, he asks, how does one deal with pseudoscience, which even the students' parents may believe in, and may even believe in passionately? Um, and being a teacher himself, he this is the main reason, he says that this is the main reason why I haven't dealt with astrology in education, because I don't wish to put children in a spot where they have to decide on opposing views from two different sources, both of whom they should love and respect. So how would you respond to it?
Yeah, that is an amazing question. I will say I use pseudoscience as part of an overall effort in the class. It's an important part, but it's not, I don't jump in just with pseudoscience. And actually, the first thing I would say is one of the most important skills with critical thinking is separating our identity from a belief. It is really hard to be objective about a belief if we see it as us. We will literally view threats to the belief as a personal threat and will respond by defending the belief, which means that we're not being objective about it. And if our goal is to be objective about it, then we have to detach. And I tell my students to think instead of their identity not as a set of beliefs, but almost more like a scientist. So someone who is curious about their beliefs, is skeptical about them and demands evidence, and recognizes they could be wrong. So humble, but it's about the process. It is helping students think through these things. Now, when I address these, then I don't start in class with beliefs that are potentially triggering. So if we go straight in with misinformation that is personally really important to students because it's part of their family identity and so on, then it's not going to work. They're just going to get defensive. So I actually, I like to think of beliefs like a spectrum, and I start in the middle with something that is not threatening at all. Something like, what is the capital of Australia? Or in my classes, I start with witchcraft too, because my students don't tend to believe in witchcraft. But I'll start here and then I'll move slowly out. And I move slowly out in two directions. We're really polarized in the United States. So there are some beliefs that are strongly associated with conservative identity and some that are strongly associated with liberal identity. And so I'll start here and then I go sort of out in both directions because I want students to see that I'm not tracking their tribe, right? I'm not going after your identity. We all believe things that are potentially spurious. So I move out, and I save the really triggering stuff to lead in the semester when I have given students the tools that they need to evaluate these claims, and also hopefully given them the attitude of someone like a scientist who is curious, skeptical, humble, willing to change their minds, etc.
So empowering students with the right tools is the main idea here. Of course, I guess each one of us would have to take the time to understand when we are ready to use those tools, isn't it? But it's important to have those tools in the first place.
It's important to have the tools. I just want to stop you for a second. It's important to have the tools. And when I give students the tools, it is harder to be skeptical about something. It is harder to use the tools when something is important to us. So when teaching the students the tools, I also teach them when you're most likely to not want to use those tools. Yes. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
You can elaborate on that point. Like, what do you mean by when not to use the tools?
We're most likely to fall for misinformation when it confirms what we already believe, when it triggers strong emotions, and then if it's repeated. So knowing those tendencies of when we're most likely to fall for misinformation is a good tool. It's part of a tool that helps students understand this is when it's hardest for me to use those tools, those critical thinking tools, and when it's most important for me to turn those tools on and use them. So they need to be aware of when they're most likely to fall for misinformation to know that those are really the times that the tools are most important.
For instance?
So, for example, the being triggered emotionally, right? So like if I go straight into a class and I start talking about climate change denial, my conservative students are going to be probably pretty triggered. However, if I've waited till later in the semester and I've taught my students that threats to your identity are likely to trigger your emotions, that means now is when I really need to use those tools. Or you're scrolling across social media and you see a post and the post makes you really angry and it confirms what you already think is true. That's the time that I need to be most skeptical and use the tools.
It's a great point to keep in mind. So with all these ideas, all these important points in mind, let's now get into the 11 characteristics of pseudoscience. Okay, so you identify one of the characteristics to be unfalsifiable. Now, what does this mean? Yeah, what's unfalsifiable?
Yeah, this is one of the most important concepts and one of the most difficult. Falsifiable means there is potentially a way to prove it wrong. So a falsifiable claim is one that theoretically there is a way to test it and prove it wrong. A claim that has been proven false is by definition a falsifiable claim, right? It has been tested and been falsified. The problem is that some claims aren't able to be proven wrong, which means that evidence is basically useless. There's no, because we can't use evidence to prove it wrong, any evidence that seems in support of it is kind of meaningless. So I break down how claims aren't falsifiable, like supernatural claims aren't falsifiable. Subjective claims like opinions and morals, ethics, those aren't falsifiable. Making excuses, ad hoc excuses, makes things unfalsifiable. And vague claims. This one is really hard because vague is, we often impart our own meanings. Like if a supplement says that it boosts your immune system or it supports healthy gut function, that doesn't actually say anything. And in the United States, they have to use those vague claims because if they didn't, they could be in violation of the FDA. But as a consumer, I see that and I go, wait a minute, it supports a healthy respiratory system. That must mean it's really great. When in actuality, it didn't say anything. So vague is probably one of the harder ones. With my students, I also use, it's very silly. So apologies for this, but I know my audience and humor helps. I'll say something like, Pythagoras, like the Pythagorean theorem. So Pythagoras was part of a group that was trying to apply mathematical reasoning to everything. I mean, he was a really smart dude, right? But he also had some beliefs that were less than smart. And one of them was that if you farted, it was your soul leaving your body. Okay. So, I mean, my students love this. They get a laugh out of it, right? Because, fart humor is always good. But also then, okay, he wouldn't eat beans because he was afraid of his soul escaping, right? So I pose this to my students. Farting is your soul escaping your body. Can we prove that wrong? Right? And so, they have a really great conversation. Well, wait a minute. What is a soul? Well, dogs fart. Dogs aren't supposed to have souls. Does this mean dogs have souls? Like, if I fart every time, does that little bits of my soul leave? Right? So they start these really interesting conversations about it and finally get to, well, you can't really test that. Now Pythagoras may have had reasons for his beliefs that, when I farted, I felt like a piece of my soul was leaving. I don't know what he told but I'm certain he had what he thought were reasons for that belief. But because we can't prove it wrong, then, that claim is kind of useless. Yeah. So I know my audience.
Okay, so pseudoscience is unfalsifiable. All right. So could you give us an example of how scientific claims are falsifiable? And why is this so? Why are scientific claims falsifiable?
Yeah. So, like, for example, if I said that, so for example, like evolutionary theory, we could falsify evolutionary theory by finding fossils, modern fossils, 500 years, a million years ago. We could falsify germ theory by discovering that germs don't actually make us sick. We could falsify cell theory by discovering organisms that aren't composed of cells. If I said that, I could test gravity by, I'm on the third floor of a building, by opening the window and stepping outside and seeing if I fall. So there are ways to test these ideas. And so the question is, and actually this is a really good tip actually for critical thinking. Don't look for evidence to support what you believe because you're gonna find it. is really easy to find evidence to support your belief. The question is, what would prove it wrong? So always look for, well, I think this is true. What might prove me wrong? And then if you're looking for that instead, you're more likely to potentially be right. And you're certainly more likely to find where you believe something that you're kind of protecting from being falsified. We tend to do that, by the way. Our unfalsifiable beliefs are some of the ones that are most important to us. And so we protect them. We put them in like a shield of evidence, and we don't want them to be wrong. And so, again, that's another one of those emotional connections. We need to know that about ourselves. And if aligning our beliefs with the truth is what's important to us, then we need to instead think about, how would I falsify this belief?
You also speak of how pseudoscientific claims profess certainty. Now, many listeners may believe this to be true of scientists and textbooks. One may even argue that this certainty is why we rely on science to make important decisions, including those related to human lives. Uh, could you tell us how science and pseudoscience differ in the certainty of their claims?
This is another great example of using pseudoscience to teach science. So scientific claims, very common misconception about science, is that science proves. And I'll hear people say, like, especially if they don't want to believe something, well, I'll believe it when science is proven. But science never proves explanations. So again, I'm going to do my spectrum thing because I really like spectrums. But if there's a spectrum of 0 to 100% certainty, we never get to 100%. As we get more evidence, we can become more certain. We reduce uncertainty, but we never get to 100% certainty. This is a really good tool, again, for real life. I always start by asking my students not whether they think a claim is true or not. How sure are you that this claim is true? Put it on a scale. 0 to 100%. And just that basic exercise gets them to stop thinking about things like true or false. Pseudoscience, though, it's a spectrum. And what we want to do is move, right? We want to be able to change our minds. Evidence doesn't support it. I'm going to go this way. More evidence doesn't support it. I'm going to go this way. Pseudoscience, though, tends to overpromise. It tends to be really certain. It puts on that air of certainty. And humans don't like uncertainty. Like, uncertainty is uncomfortable. Not knowing can be disconcerting. And so learning to be comfortable with uncertainty or with ambiguity or with not knowing is an important critical thinking skill. And it helps you then be aware for pseudoscientific claims that promise to prove and solve all of your problems with just this really simple solution. We fall for those things because we want the certainty, as opposed to accepting when your doctor says, well, the evidence suggests this, which might mean this. I think one of our best courses of treatment might be effective, but has these potential downsides. To most of us, that sounds wishy-washy, right? But that's how someone who is proportioning their beliefs to the evidence will speak.
So that we know all sides to it, we know how much to be certain about a certain thing, right? Now, a characteristic of pseudoscience that seems closely related to certainty is that pseudoscientific claims are unchanging. So it's something related to the spectrum that you were saying, right? I mean, if you are certain, you don't change, basically. So in what ways, if you could elaborate further on what ways are pseudoscientific claims unchanging?
Yeah, there are so many great examples of pseudosciences that have an origin story that have literally not changed since the origin story. Chiropractic is basically the same. Homeopathy is basically the same. Astrology is basically the same. Iridiology, which is the idea that you can diagnose what's wrong with your sicknesses by the flecks of color in your iris. Pseudoscience will often arrive at a conclusion, assume that it's right, and then resists attempts to disprove part of it or all of it and change with evidence. It's just certain it's right. And one step further, it often views that criticism as a conspiracy. Scientists, when a scientist publishes something or puts out their research, they expect to be criticized, right? And other scientists are happy to try and prove them wrong. That's how you make a name for yourself, right? It is really harsh, but it's important. There's this culture of criticism. Pseudoscience views that criticism as a conspiracy, as a personal attack, as opposed to this is how we test ideas and updating.
Update details, update facts, update, whatever we think is a fact. Now,
Yes.
coming to that point, one may argue that some of the most foundational concepts in science seek to identify unchanging regularities, or what we call laws of nature.
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that? This
Well,
seems
there's
to
a
sort of
difference.
yeah.
Well, because first of all, laws are pretty rare in the natural sciences. They're more common in the physical sciences because laws are a description of nature and they're usually mathematical. Theories are much more common in the natural sciences, which are explanations based on a large body of evidence. They have withstood attempts to disprove, and they are very useful in that they provide testable predictions. When I say unchanging, it is evidence suggests you're wrong. Change your conclusions or alter aspects of your science, of what you claim is your science. So if we've gotten to the point where we can say something is a law or a theory, it doesn't mean that it can't ever change. It means that up to this point, it has been attempted to be disproven and it has not been. And so it is still open to change. It's just that we have so much evidence in support of it that it's probably not going to change a whole lot, but we still leave ourselves open to it. Does that make sense?
So basically, we are making, noting what our assumptions are, and we count some of these laws as some of the assumptions on the basis of which we are drawing conclusions, right? And these laws themselves can change, and if and when they do, then we'll have to come back to all the conclusions that we've made based on these laws and try to adjust those two, right? I hope I got that.
Yeah. So in science, laws and theories are as certain as we're going to get. It doesn't mean that they can't change. If the evidence suggests it, they will change. But to this point, the attempts at disproving them have not been successful. As opposed to pseudoscience, a lot of evidence suggests that you might want to change these, and they don't.
I see. Now, another characteristic you identify is that pseudoscientific claims lack plausible mechanism. Now, for those who may be unfamiliar with this term, could you tell us what it means, especially the word plausible?
So this characteristic I've noticed is a really powerful one if you know how to use it, but it's difficult to use. So plausible mechanism means a probable way, a likely way that something might act. Now, it's not a deal breaker because there are things in science that we haven't figured out yet how they might work. But with pseudoscience, there tends to be some really egregious examples of things that there is no way we can imagine how that might work. And to the point where they violate everything we know about how nature works. So, for example, astrology, modern, how we use astrology in the United States, is based on what is thought to be a 2,000-year-old system that at the time they drew constellations in the sky over what was in the horizon at that time of the year. And they came up with these series of constellations. They then, modern astrologers claim that the star sign at the time of your birth influences your personality, your life outcomes, and so on. So there are only two ways at which things might impact us. So, for example, one of them is electromagnetism, in this case, light. So the light that gets to us from those stars. And the other would be gravity. So, but at the time of your birth, the lights in the delivery room and the doctor have more of an influence on you than the stars at the sky at the time. So it is really difficult to imagine how the different constellations at the time you were born might impact you. Also, so that's lack of a plausible mechanism. Like, how might that work? Those claims have been tested as well, and they have been falsified. But even going back to, but how might this work? How might it work, right? That is what we're getting at here with plausible mechanism. If somebody claims something and you really can't think about how the mechanism by which that might function, then it's a pretty good sign that it might be pseudoscience. One step further, if the only ways that something might work don't fit with how we know the world works, it's a really good sign that the mechanism might not be a plausible one.
Now, you touched a point there, saying that even in science, there are several claims that may not have been fully understood, right? So, just to elaborate a little bit further, um, or let me just reiterate if I've understood it correctly. So, even though some claims have not been understood fully in science, let's say, some examples that I can think of is that we know we make memories, but we don't know the entire mechanism involved. Um, Now, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is plausible mechanism is a mechanism that fits into what do we know so far, even if it is incomplete, right? So, some mechanism to explain a phenomenon that sort of fits into how we understand the world so far, that can still be, considered scientific, whereas pseudoscientific claims would use, the plausible mechanisms won't fit into how we understand the world at all. Did I say that right? Like, did I understood it right?
Yeah. There's so much interesting there. So the aspects of science that I'm talking about that we don't quite know how they might work are, so far that I know, within the realm of physical science. Like, for example, dark matter or string theory. And I am in no way in a position to explain any of that. So, but there are aspects of science that that we may not know how they work yet. It doesn't mean that we won't someday. And they don't currently violate what we know about how the world works, but it does mean that right now we don't understand it. You did talk about memories there. So if, for example, we have someone who claims to have seen a ghost. So with a ghost, we might have two explanations: what someone claims to have seen and remembered, and how we know about how the world works, which is that we currently don't have any good scientific evidence for the existence of ghosts. We do, however, have lots of evidence that our perceptions can fool us, and that our memories are incomplete and biased and constructed. So while we may not be able to prove or disprove either one of those explanations, it's much more likely that someone's perception and memory might be fooling them than we have violated everything we know about how the world works and you actually saw the ghost of somebody who is undead. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Now, many pseudoscientific claims are seemingly backed by evidence. And in the booklet, you highlight its reliance on anecdotes as evidence. Now, for those who are not familiar with this term, could you explain what an anecdote means?
An anecdote is a personal experience that is used for evidence. So I saw a ghost is an anecdote. What I'm saying is ghosts exist because I saw one. Anecdotes are really powerful. The human brain likes stories. So if I give you, like, I have a ghost story and I'm happy to tell you it if you'd like to, but like if I tell you a story, it's very powerful. Like it's often emotional, and it appeals to the part of our brain that's a storyteller and makes sense of the world via stories. Data is much less useful. Yeah, wait a minute. It's more useful. It's much less interesting. So our brain thinks in terms of stories as opposed to data. Anecdotes are the lifeblood of pseudoscience, and I cannot stress this enough. When we test things with science, we do our best to minimize our biases. We use larger sample sizes. If we can, we use double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, right? We test things in our attempt to be unbiased. But if I just tell you a story about how I used that night cream and my skin looked fresh as day, right? It took years off my skin. Or if I told you about the time that I tried homeopathy and it worked, or I went to an astrologer and my horoscope was right, all of those are stories. And so what we know about anecdotes is that we can misperceive our experiences, right? We don't actually see the world as it is. And our biases are constantly feeding us, filtering what we experience. We also know that anecdotes aren't controlled. So my experience, maybe going to somebody like a chiropractor saying that it was effective. Well, if we actually want to test chiropractic, my personal experience isn't very useful. We want to control. Anecdotes also aren't typical. They tend to not be typical in that there's a lot of things out there. An anecdote might just be a piece like that's cherry picked. And we also know, unfortunately, that people can lie. And so because of that, we really need to be careful of the use of anecdotes as evidence. Now, a lot of pseudoscience, their claims don't pass good science. So all they have is anecdotes. However, they also know that we are convinced by anecdotes. So they don't need good evidence. They just need good anecdotes. So be really skeptical if the evidence being presented for something is an anecdote, especially one that's emotional or vivid. They know that's going to bypass our critical thinking and we're going to stick to it as opposed to demanding better evidence.
Now, we have a question from Sheikh Basharat Hussain. And this is going to be a great for me to transition to my next question and next characteristic of pseudoscience that I would like to ask you. Chance or coincidence plays an important role in solidifying the claims of pseudoscience. Example, astrology works on coincidence at times. So, how can we counter these?
Yeah, I mean, this is why in science we rely so heavily on repeatability. Repeatability, being able to do the same thing and getting the same results, no matter how we test it, catches our errors, potential fraud, and also coincidence. Things can happen, right? Add to if we want to believe in the pseudoscience, so for example, with astrology. So let's say that I go to an astrologer 10 times And 2 of those 10 times they're accurate. Again, it's probably just a coincidence, right? You roll the die enough times and some of them are going to be right. I'm going to remember those 2 times and forget those 8 times because of my confirmation bias and my desire to believe in that claim. And so I remember the times that the astrologer was right and not all the other times the astrologer was wrong. So this is again why for the pseudoscience itself, we want to test using controlled studies if we can, and then try to repeat those claims. But as an individual, we also need to know why we might fall for those things.
So that brings me to the next question. So a related characteristic of pseudoscience is that it cherry picks evidence. And I think that's exactly what you were coming to. Now, just to elaborate, what does this mean?
So cherry picking is the idea of selecting pieces of evidence that supports what you believe and neglecting the ones that don't. I literally like to think of all of the evidence for a claim like cherries on a tree. And some of those pieces of evidence, what we want to do if we're evaluating a claim fairly is look at all of the cherries on the cherry tree. However, we could select pieces of evidence, pick the cherries and say, here, my claim is true. There's a great meme that goes around. I show it to my students, and it's why water is bad for you. Now, we all know that water is essential for life, right? We have to have water. But if I told you that everyone who drinks water will die, or that all serial killers have admitted to drinking water, or that pesticides are made of water, or that people die by drowning, I could select pieces of evidence to make a case that is not representative of reality. Cherry picking can happen intentionally, if somebody is intentionally trying to deceive. But it can also happen just because of our desire to believe. Right? So what we can do is find the pieces of evidence. It's motivated reasoning. We find the pieces of evidence that supports our belief. And we overlook, discount the stuff that doesn't.
Now, one could argue that unless all the data from an experiment, like the entire cherry tree, is revealed to them, it would be hard for them to identify such instances of cherry picking. So how does the process of science reduce the likelihood of this?
Well, I just want to go back to the individual level. If I am trying to figure out if a claim is true, looking for evidence that I'm right is not the way to get there. This is again why looking for evidence that you're wrong is more likely to lead you to the right answer. So if the whole cherry tree is on there and you believe something, your tendency is to find the pieces of evidence to support your claim. Instead, try to find the pieces of evidence that doesn't, right? What might prove you wrong? And this is why science is powerful, actually. Science tries to prove itself wrong. Science has to be falsifiable, and then it tries to falsify. It's not looking for evidence that it's right. It's trying to find holes in what it believes. It's trying to find evidence that it might be wrong. Richard Feynman has this great quote, we're trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible because only in that can we find progress. Right? So look for the cherries that might disprove you. It's going to get you to the better answer.
All right, so let's move to the next characteristic. Often, pseudoscience claims are persuasive because they seem to use logic and reasoning. And you mention in your booklet that many of these claims are characterized by logical fallacies. Again, what do you mean by a logical fallacy?
So logical fallacies are errors in reasoning. They are ways to potentially invalidate a conclusion. There are about 1 trillion logical fallacies. I'm probably exaggerating a bit. And the worst part is that each fallacy goes by like 6 different names, and many of them are related to other fallacies. And if you get lost in the web of logical fallacies, you're never going to get out. However, there are about 6 to 10 logical fallacies that are incredibly common, especially in pseudoscience and science denial. So I teach my students to recognize these fallacies, and they're not necessarily then hard and fast rules like this fallacy is committed, so this claim is not true. But it's more like if what they're doing is trying to convince you of a claim by using logical fallacies, as opposed to providing good evidence, then there's a really good chance that it's pseudoscience.
Can you give some examples?
So in health pseudoscience in particular, one of the biggest logical fallacies is the appeal to nature. So it is the idea that if something is natural, it must be better or safer or more effective than something that's unnatural. And there are lots of problems with this. Like one is what does it mean to be natural? And that's a really good question, actually, that is hard to answer and makes for a fun discussion question if your students are to an age where they can do this. Like, for example, is oil natural? And then, yeah, probably. I mean, it's decomposed things that used to be alive. Well, okay, so then is plastic natural? Because plastic is made from oil, right? So there are different it is hard to define natural, but also it is just not true that natural is safer or better. I mean, some of the most toxic things that we know are from nature. And, you know, like I can very easily point to about half dozen plants outside my window that if I wanted to kill you very quickly, I'd probably tell you to eat, right? So it doesn't mean that it's natural, so it's safer. So if something is saying that it's all natural or it comes from nature, or conversely, if it tries to, so it says that, you know, the other stuff is full of chemicals and it's toxic and so on. Those are a great sign that they're saying that their stuff might be better because it's natural versus unnatural. Appeal to tradition is also very common. This is the idea that because it's old, that it must be better. So for example, someone might say that astrology is a 2,000-year-old system, right? Or that Reiki is hundreds of years old, or that by saying something is old, what we think is we have this bias that like the ancients must have been more in harmony with nature and have better wisdom than we do today. I like to point out to my students that, you know, just 100 years ago, we were giving kids cough syrup with codeine in it, with cocaine in it. They used to treat impotence by using shock belts, or they would treat mental illnesses by drilling holes in skulls. I mean, we used to do all kinds of things that weren't necessarily great. The trick is there evidence? Are they supplanting tradition for evidence? So those two taken together are a great sign that somebody is trying to convince you using these fallacies as opposed to evidence.
Now, Mamata Bhakti, I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Well, Mamta asks a question. What is the difference between pseudoscience and superstition?
Well, that is an amazing question. Pseudoscience pretends to be science, right? So it is something that is dressed itself up to try and get the legitimacy of science without actually following the methods of science. Superstitions tend to be where we've noticed patterns and assumed that there's some sort of meaning behind it. And those patterns and the meaning. So, for example, I hope my mom's not watching because she's very superstitious, and I'm going to talk about my mom. You know, my mom thinks that if a black cat walks in front of her, she's going to have bad luck, or that if she walks under a ladder, or one time she told me that she was afraid of Friday the 13th. I've always known that she's afraid of Friday the 13th. Is that a thing there, Friday the 13th?
No, not in India. I think it's more of an American thing.
Right. So she said, afraid of Friday the 13th. And finally I was like, well, why do you think this day is bad? And she really thought about it. And then she says, well, when I was a kid on a Friday the 13th, somebody stole my lunchbox. And I was waiting for more, like, right. But that was it. right? She has the superstition. She's gotten it from the culture. She's noticed a pattern, and she's decided that that evidence confirms her bias, and she's just going to keep using it to keep seeing it. Now, here's the thing. I told her, it's like, so you realize that there's like 7.8 billion people on the planet, and that bad things are going to happen on Friday the 13th. And also good things are going to happen. And also bad things happen on days that aren't Friday the 13th, right? The question is that pattern real? And so here's where we can use science to test superstitions. Superstitions don't tend to dress them up in science, though. There are more of these personal beliefs, cultural beliefs even, that are due to pattern recognition and imparting this sort of agency onto it. And sorry, Mom, if you're watching.
Actually, though Friday the 13th is not so much an Indian thing, black cat walking in front, that is
Oh, we did?
something that is something many of us, like many people believe. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so I hope that answers Mamta's question about the difference between pseudoscience and superstition. I think that's a very important distinction to make. Now, coming back to the characteristics of pseudoscience, you also say that pseudoscience lacks adequate peer review. Now, for those unfamiliar with this process, could you briefly tell us what peer review in science means and why is this important?
So remember, scientists have to submit their claims to other scientists. Science is a social process of collecting and evaluating evidence as experts, each trying and incentivized to prove each other wrong. So with peer review, what happens is you have done your study or evaluated evidence in some way, and you submit it to a journal and a professional journal, and the journal will hire independent reviewers. Usually it's a blind process where they don't know who you are, you don't know who the reviewers are, and they do everything they can to tell you why you're wrong. Right? They find the mistakes that you've made in your methodology, or have you considered this statistical analysis, or have you considered this explanation for what you've observed? It's basically a organized system of criticism. So it can go back and forth. If it's accepted, it gets published into this journal. I've noticed that at least in the States, there's a huge emphasis on getting students to read peer-reviewed literature as part of what people deem to be science literacy. And I really struggle with this because peer-reviewed literature is where experts talk to other experts. It is highly specific. I mean, my background is plant ecology, specifically fire ecology on prairies. And so when it comes to like mRNA vaccines, I really struggle reading that research. I'm not equipped. I don't have the background knowledge. I don't know the body of literature. And so that's really where experts are fighting with each other about this. But that's important because it is through this collective system of evaluating this evidence that we stand a better chance of getting a right answer. Pseudoscience, it's not perfect, right? But it's better than any system we have. Pseudoscience tends to avoid that, and it does it in a couple of ways. The first thing is it will just bypass it entirely and go straight to the public. Right? The public doesn't understand the process of science and peer review. So I'm just going to write a book instead, and I'm going to go on Oprah, and I'm going to publish an op-ed in a Huffington Post. But I'm just going to start a social media account where I'm just going to tell people all of my claims. And conversely, I'm going to say that any criticism of that is because the scientists don't like what I have to say. They don't like me telling you the truth. But I'm here to tell you the truth. And here's all of my evidence that hasn't undergone peer review. The other way that they do it, and it's a bit more insidious, is that they make their own journals that look scientific. So they'll make special journals that don't have as much rigor associated with it. And this is really a problem too, because then you get people who think peer-reviewed literature is the best source of information. So they go to Google Scholar and they type in what they believe, and then they find these journals that have published these low-quality studies, and then think, well, see, this is scientific. But they don't understand that that journal was probably created with the sole purpose of publishing these low-quality studies that couldn't pass peer review in better scientific journals.
But they are peer reviewed.
Maybe. And if they are peer reviewed, it's almost in name only. Whereas as opposed to experts trying to find flaws in your evidence, it is other people who believe what you believe going, yeah, this looks like it's true, and then letting it pass and going into the literature. That's why, like, if you've got higher level students, like maybe high school level students, showing students these journals, pseudoscientific journals created for this low quality evidence is a great way for them to see sort of what I call next level pseudoscience, where they really go through the trappings of science. They're pretending to such a degree that it's even easier to be fooled by it.
I hope I don't digress, but just what comes immediately to mind is some journals these days are sort of publishing even the peer review process, what comments came, what was the response, and so on. I guess, I mean, of course, for middle and high school level, I'm not sure how helpful that is. Like you said, they may not be equipped to understand the language, but at least it's out there. Now, however, the several studies suggest that peer review in science can also be biased and flawed. For example, some of the main biases may be related to the gender, race, and geography of scientists, of authors who are trying to publish. Now, do you see these biases and flaws as being different from the kind one is likely to encounter in pseudoscientific claims?
Ooh, that is a really good question. The word bias has lots of different meanings. So with my students falling for pseudoscience, we're really talking about cognitive biases, which are the kinds of biases that we all have, in that they're part of the wiring, right? As humans, we're all prone to confirmation bias. We're all prone to overconfidence bias. We're all prone to sunk cost bias, right? We're all prone to them. Gender biases, racial biases, geographic biases, those are learned biases. They can still be unconscious, but we learn them through our culture. Those are important. This is why the more diverse a community is, the more likely they are to find the flaws in each other's thinking, right? So for example, if a community has geographic biases, then they're more likely to be able to find their tendency to only publish things from, the Ivy League, for example. So yes, diversity is really a plus when it comes to this kind of thing. The other thing that you said was, because you're talking about peer review, it's not perfect, to be sure, and there are things that we could do to improve it. But I think that when we're comparing it to pseudoscience, which really doesn't have it, or it's just going through the motions, it's better than not. Does that make sense?
Could you just explain that again?
So the process of peer review still has its limitations. It's still limited by the biases of the people that are reviewing, for example. But pseudoscience either doesn't bother with peer review, or it goes through the process by using people who have the same biases as they do, specifically, so that they end up confirming what they already believe. as opposed to a good faith effort to try and find each other's biases and discount them.
Yeah, clear. Um, Another characteristic of pseudoscience is that it makes extraordinary or exaggerated claims. Now, this can be tricky because what is perceived as being exaggerated can be relative. I mean, think of all the technologies that we have today and how they are advancing at an unimaginable pace. Things that once seemed extraordinary and possible only in science fiction, like deep space exploration or even video calling, have now become a reality. Now, in such a scenario, for a non expert, the line between fiction and reality or between ordinary and extraordinary can be blurry. So, how does one use this characteristic to identify pseudoscientific claims?
Well, that is a really good question. And for the record, I hold that this kind of video conferencing is magic because I just don't understand it. So this basically gets to skepticism. So with skepticism, what we're trying to do is proportion our acceptance of a claim to the evidence. And the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the evidence should be. When I introduce this concept with my students, I usually give them a really silly story like, imagine that you are a boss and you have an employee that works for you, Jane. And Jane is a great employee. She's worked for you for years. She's always on time. She's very reliable. And one day Jane is late. And Jane says, I was late because I got a flat tire. Okay. I mean, Jane's always been reliable. So flat tire, I mean, if I was really being a stickler, I may ask for a tow truck receipt or something like that. But if Jane says she was late because she was abducted by aliens, right? That's an extraordinary claim. And now my standard of evidence just like, wait a minute, what? We don't know aliens exist. We don't know that they've been here. And now you're saying you were abducted by them. You're going to have to give me some really good evidence to believe you here. So starting out with something that's very silly like that can be helpful. And then, yeah, you're right. What it seems extraordinary to one person might not be to someone else. That would be a fun question actually to explore with a group of students to see what kinds of differences that they have and so on, and get them into the practice of, well, what kind of evidence would it take for me to accept that claim?
Okay. Now, speaking of magic, okay, so Sheikh Basharat Hussain has another question. Pseudoscience mostly uses, or let me say, misuses science or logic to push their agenda. What about miracles that we are being taught or told at a younger age? Doesn't it form the basis of anything unscientific? Um, yeah, I guess, if miracles exist,
Yeah,
miracles and connection, magic, miracles versus pseudoscience.
yeah, that's
How?
a really good question. I personally think that by teaching students to accept some claims without evidence, especially extraordinary claims, does make them prone to believing other things without evidence. It's really hard to protect some beliefs from evidence and subject others to evidence. And where do we draw that line? What beliefs do we protect? What beliefs don't we? And so, yeah, I personally think that we should be subjecting all of our beliefs to evidence. Now, I also don't have children, so there's that. I have never had to go through this process of how to expose kids to cultural beliefs that people accept on faith. But maybe even just starting with the idea of the difference between faith and belief And again, if you have students that are old enough, getting them to think about the impact of being able to think critically in some areas, but being unwilling to expose other beliefs to that. I hope that answered your question. I was have my own cultural frame of reference when it comes to that.
Yeah, and this sort of links to your earlier response about keeping that spectrum in mind, isn't it? So the pseudoscientific claims around certain maybe mythological claims, miracles, these do fall somewhere in that spectrum, and maybe getting to that eventually would help.
Yeah, I do not ever get to religious
Okay.
beliefs on my spectrum. I go by if you're familiar with Stephen Jay Gould, is a wonderful evolutionary biologist and science writer, and he had a concept he called NOMA, or non-overlapping magisteria, where science and religion serve different purposes and different ways of looking at the world, and the danger when one usurps the other. And so I like to use that framework. But that said, if someone is making a claim that can be tested, then trying to use the evidentiary standard on those claims is a good practice. But if someone is making a claim that is not testable, like a lot of supernatural, religious-based claims are not testable, then recognizing that those are not falsifiable claims, and if I believe that, don't use evidence to support it, recognize the type of belief that is, and accept it for what it is.
That's a good point. So, I mean, you can continue having faith in something, continue having believing in it, but at the same time acknowledge that there is no evidence to support it.
Yes.
Right? So it's the acknowledgement that's important, and not being in denial about it. But you can continue to have beliefs that are, core to your being. Great point. Now, another characteristic of pseudoscience is its use of technobabble. Now, to many listeners, technobabble may sound very much like the specialized vocabulary of science. This technology used X and X radiation, and some part of the body is mentioned and whatnot. So, it can get really, really technical even in science. And to somebody, that may sound like technobabble. It's very hard to distinguish. So, do you have any suggestions on how one could differentiate between the two?
So Technobabble is one of my favorite characteristics of pseudoscience because it can be so funny. But you're right. A lot of students confuse Technobabble with science they just don't understand. And again, there's one of those where showing students primary literature can just overwhelm them and then realize they don't understand it and then not be able to see the difference. So what I want students to do is recognize that when scientists talk to each other, they almost speak a different language, but that Technobabble either makes up words or mostly uses science-y words, but in a context where they lose all of their meaning. And to the average person, then you see something like that, and because you can't tell the difference between scientists talking to each other and something that makes no sense, it looks science-y, right? They all look the same. And so getting students to understand, having students create Technobabble is a great way to do it. But anytime something appeals to quantum theory, it's a pretty good chance that it's Technobabble. I mean, nobody understands quantum theory. It's a great quote by Feynman again. If something is transcending the physical, or it is, at the cellular level, or something about energy, all of those are a great sign that it's Technobabble. There's Technobabble generators online that are really fun. When I have students make Technobabble, they can go to those websites. Another fun way to do it is to take real scientific studies and almost like word jumble them together, pick words that you like and then just make a sentence out of them.
Yeah, that sounds fun. Definitely sounds fun.
Yeah,
I have a comment from Mamta, who had earlier asked the pseudoscience versus superstition question. She wants to thank you. Thanks, ma'am. Very satisfied with the answer. And I asked because many people have a wrong conception about pseudoscience. Thank you for that answer. Now, another question from the audience member, Amol Kate, who is also actually one of the editors of iwonder and a teacher, educator. He says, as you're saying anecdotes are powerful, as a science person, what one can do to connect facts and experiences to address pseudoscience. So, as a person with the ability to identify science, so somebody with a science background, how can they uh, use their skills to connect facts and experiences to address pseudoscience? I hope I understood that question right.
I'm hoping I'm going to answer your question here, and if I don't, please ask again. As a science communicator, I really struggle with this. So part of what I'm doing now is trying through my Thinking is Power to, on social media and on my website, to communicate science. It is true that we connect more with stories. And I struggle with this because often when I'm trying to explain a concept, what I do is I use a story. However, the stories that I use are exemplars of that particular concept. But again, part of me wonders if I am, again, convincing, if I'm sending the wrong message by using the story. It's a really fine line that we do. The question is, does the anecdote reflect the evidence? So some anecdotes can, right? Anecdotes aren't completely useless. So what I try and do then is find an anecdote that best represents the evidence and use it to explain the concept. I hope that answers your question. Do you think, Vijeta?
Yeah, I see. Yeah. I think so. I mean, his question was how to use anecdotes effectively in teaching science. Uh, and I think we addressed that. Now, there is an interesting question from Raghuram Arkalgud. He says, I see a violin there. So he's referring to the violin behind that. And I had been wondering to ask if you play violin. Now, people claim that music helps patients recover quickly. Also, that trees grow better when exposed to music. Um, is it science or pseudoscience?
That's a really good question. My husband's a cellist, so that's his cello.
Oh, that's a cello. Sorry. Okay.
It's pretty hard to see. It's all the way in the back wall. Yeah, I'm actually a pianist, and my husband's a conductor and cellist. So I'm unfamiliar with some of those claims. I mean, I've heard those claims, but I'm unfamiliar with the evidence behind it. That would be a really good, interesting, maybe exercise to evaluate the evidence for those things and see. I'm assuming there is all kinds of misleading and pseudoscientific information out there, but is there good evidence for it as well? I don't know.
So it's over to you, actually, to find out, right? I mean, this is over to the audience member to find out whether this
Well,
is pseudoscience or not. Like, I
it's
mean, if he can learn and if he can test the tools that he learned today to actually go into.
well, yeah, and I do this with my class as well, because my class will bring up, well, have you heard this? Actually, no, I haven't heard that. Why don't we look into it? we've learned some things. So let's explore this together. And also that creates such a great atmosphere of, first of all, humility. I don't know, collaboration. Let's find this out together. And it's exploring something that the students are clearly interested in. So in this spirit of inquiry, let's find out. And also, if you find the answer to that, please let me know.
So, Raghuram, I hope you take the effort and take up this challenge. Okay. All right. There is one more question from Tirang Rangsaraname. So Tirang asks, how do we break the assumption that science has no role in matters that are emotional? Therefore, there is a truth or reality beyond science.
There is this idea that science is
Beyond science.
without emotion. The problem is that humans are emotional. And so when I may take a bit of a tangent here, but I hope it addresses your question. I use Jonathan Haidt's elephant and the rider analogy when I'm helping my students with metacognition. So Daniel Kahneman had a system 1 and system 2, but the elephant and the rider I find is very useful for my students. The idea is, if you've not heard this analogy, that in your brain you have an elephant and then a rider that sits on top of the elephant. And the elephant is the part of the brain that is instinctual, right? It's the fight, flight, or freeze. It is automatic. It's always on. You don't have to turn it on. It's just constantly working. It is emotional. It is biased. It takes shortcuts. It jumps to conclusions. It notices patterns. It jumps to conclusions. And then it suggests that to the writer. Now, the writer is the part of the brain that is that can be rational and logical, that can think through things and that you associate with you. But honestly, most of the time, the writer just says, oh, the elephant says this, so it's probably true. And then it finds reasons to justify what the elephant always says. When I'm working with my students, I give them this analogy, and then throughout the semester, come back to it in terms of, okay, you've heard this claim. What is your elephant doing? Right? Notice your elephant. Is your elephant emotional? Is it something that I know your writer has reasons to support it, but is the elephant giving your writer that analogy, belief, or have you actually thought about it? So the point is, it's metacognition. It's being aware of what your brain is doing. Our emotions and emotional reasoning can lead us to incorrect conclusions. Emotions are useful, of course. The point is to be aware of your emotions and the potential role they may be playing in your reasoning process. I see the elephant and the rider is a Buddhist analogy too.
Yes.
In the same context or different?
I'm not very sure.
Okay.
Not entirely sure, yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay, Chitra says that yes, it is in the same context.
Oh, wonderful.
Are there other questions? Have I missed anything? Okay, there is one other question from Sheikh Basharat Hussain. How is misinformation in the age of technology helping pseudoscience?
Wowzers. That is, yeah. The problem is that misinformation appeals to our elephant, right? The misinformation appeals to our tribal instincts, to our identities, to our confirmation bias. It riles up our emotions. And like, especially social media platforms, I mean, if it's free, you're the product, right? Its goal is to keep you on there as long as possible. And how it does that is by telling you that everything that you think is already true and that other people are really stupid because they don't believe those things, or worse, they're even evil. And here's why you should be mad, and here's why you should be outraged, and look at this dumb thing. And next thing you know, like, you just got confirmation bias. Misinformation spreads because of those things. And so basically, it's just exploited a human tendency technology has, and then it spreads this misinformation. I don't know how we solve that problem. I personally, with my students, I get them to create misinformation, and that's a really fun thing for educators. Consider whatever information you're addressing, have students make a fake news article, or have them make arguments that are illogical. So technology just enables more of it, and we as educators have to equip our students with the ability to be good consumers of information. The technology companies and our governments are not doing a good job regulating it, and so we have to help our students be good consumers of information.
Yeah. And these tools, all these 11 characteristics, I'm sure will be extremely helpful. And the more they practice them, I think they'll get better and better at identifying pseudoscience. Now, if we have no further questions, then I think let me wrap up with the final question to you. Okay, one second. Actually, Amol says, who asked about using anecdotes to explain science. He says, yeah, thanks. It's a struggle to address pseudoscience, and people don't believe in scientific facts in the first attempt. As it is mentioned in your article, they will remain to stay in the spectrum.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure. Is there a question in there?
Oh, no, there is no question. He's just...
Okay. Wonderful. I'm glad I answered it. Thank you.
So to wrap up the session, one final question. Now, in the booklet, we include a think about section. Right? We sort of, after every characteristic, we have a box saying, okay, think about the following. And we hope that this would be a great starting point for teachers who would like to use this booklet in the classroom. Melanie, would you have any additional suggestions for the teachers in our audience who might like to use the booklet in their classrooms?
The booklet, by the way, is wonderful, and I appreciate everything that you all did to communicate the 11 characteristics in such a lovely way for kids. What I would say, I think, is probably the most important is using pseudoscience should be part of a larger effort, and help students think about their thinking and help them think critically. And it includes things like detaching their identity from beliefs to be objective about it. But then we have to do our part when bringing in misinformation and pseudoscience to start with things that aren't triggering and to slowly work up to them, so that we can give our students the tools and inoculate them against this misinformation through repeated practice. And the goal, of course, is to get them to evaluate the beliefs that are more difficult. But don't start there, right? So teach them the skills, start small, and as they learn, slowly work up.
Thank you so much, Melanie. On that note, let me thank everyone who came to the webinar today. Especially Melanie, it's early in the morning for you, and thank you so much for joining us this early. And the audience has been highly interactive. We were surprised to get more than 100 responses for our quiz in a very short period of time. So really thanks a lot to everybody who participated in the quiz. I hope that made them more curious about pseudoscience and more interested in learning about it. and I hope they use the booklet and the article in their everyday experiences, and exercise them every time they come across a claim. And if you did that, and if you found it useful, do let us know by writing to us at iwonder@apu.edu.in. Thanks to everyone, and I hope you all join us again next month on November 9th, when we will have our next webinar. So thanks one and all. Bye.
Thank you.